Good morning. How are you?
Good, good. Oops, where'd you go? Got too many windows open. There you
This is a much nicer book.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I actually got it, and I got a hard copy of it this time around. Uh,
Yeah. I quite like the way that he adulterates the logo map on that
yeah,
cover.
I like that. I like the idea of the logo map. Yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting. The only problem is they don't think much about us in America.
If you mean it so bad.
It's too loose.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. The thing that I, of course, stuff on coming from where I do, I don't have a problem with territories overseas or otherwise. And and I must admit, there's sort of elements of like the Daniel Boone story. I I I know the name, but I keep confusing it with the the Bowie character from Texas.
Okay, I thought you were going to say Davy
So
Crockett,
well,
who also died at the Alamo, and who was also played by Fess
yeah.
Parker on TV. So Fess Parker played both Daniel Boone and
Yeah.
Davy Crockett.
This is where the German translation problem comes up. But it's in part with bits and pieces of your stuff and the lack of the totality of the Revolutionary War, such that
Yeah, but it was inconclusive. Yeah,
year or two, there's obviously those in Canada pushing down, raiding Kentucky.
yeah.
So, but then, of course, you guys decide to go north and try and push around in Canada, and you get your arse swept because when you come back and burn
Several
Washington.
several times. A lot of attempts were made. Yeah,
Yeah, well, if it's worth doing once, it's worth doing twice.
Mhm. Well, and actually,
like the German. It's a bit like the Germans and World Wars. So,
yeah.
but the whole premise of the first part, with what's the territory, why is the territory, what's the state versus, etc., etc., has never really sort of bounced off me before. And his intro, that's particularly based around the speech that I presume is like the 8th of December, about a day that will go down in infamy.
Right, the day.
And the toing and throwing of, oh dear, that means if we mention the Philippines, we have to mention Wake Island and whatever else. And then, of course, there is which I think, if I remember rightly, he also mentions, but maybe I knew from this, is your favourite land bridge,
Mm-hmm.
the Aleutian Islands.
Yeah.
Some of those islands went to Japan
Briefly. Yeah.
under occupancy,
Yeah.
but not for very long.
Right.
And so part and parcel of the argument over Hawaii versus the Big Island versus the American Big Island certainly goes away when the Japanese set foot on the Aleutian.
Yeah. Yeah.
Other than they were probably only seen by a few seagulls to start with. because you probably hadn't militarized them at that point.
Aleutian Islanders apparently have, in their own minds, though, possibly they may possibly have quite a beef. I remember there's the antagonist in one of my favorite science fiction books, Snow Crash, is the son of an Aleutian Islander who says we were nuked. So they definitely had some issues, at least as far as Neil Stephenson was able to.
It's like all these bad Danish people versus these lovely Greenlanders who will become the 51st state.
Oh,
Yet, of course, in the context of this world, you wouldn't let them become a state. You'd let them become a territory.
okay. So that's where you began, right, with this kind of distinction between territoriality and statehood, and I do think that has a lot. I was surprised that he raced over the sort of the settling of the American West, initially the Northwest, under the Northwest Ordinance, and then kind of farther. And he does have one map in there where he says the Indian country is all of this, the greater Northwest after the original Northwest Ordinance, the whole area that became the Michigan Territory, and then Wisconsin, and then Minnesota, all along, what became the Canadian border. And so I do think that there was a story that he could have told there about the idea of territoriality and the path to statehood, because of course the path to statehood varied quite a bit depending on the political interests of the people. Texas came in completely illegitimately, right? Texas was annexed in 1845, triggering the Mexican-American War, which he also doesn't talk that much about, right? And he kind of briefly waves at the idea of manifest destiny and its origin in the O'Sullivan article. But that idea that that it's inevitable and somehow foreordained by God that there would be a transition from this, what everybody wanted to believe and called was wilderness, and some people feared it, because it was howling wilderness. It wasn't pristine, scenic wilderness, and it was filled with scary bears and wolves and mosquitoes. And and it's kind of funny because I just this week in the evenings before going to bed, I watched a bunch of 1883. And so I got to see this completely romanticized version of, the Duttons making their way from Texas through Oklahoma, kind of very quickly through through Kansas and the Indian country, and ultimately, as the young girl is dying, into the Bozeman Valley. And that whole, in 1883 as a moment, I kind of was doing the math in my head. So, okay, this guy, the father, fought at Antietam, I think, right? And then was taken prisoner and was in a prison camp for 3 years. And so he has this horrendous kind of memory of war. But this idea of, that there was very much, to kind of bring it back to the book, there was very much of an expectation that these territories were going to be incorporated. And it was, he does kind of wave at it going by, right? That, that this is not insignificant, right? That territories would come in with all of the equal privileges and rights and responsibilities of the original 13 states.
But he doesn't want to wave at it, right? Sorry, well, go ahead.
Sorry. He makes it very clear, though, and I think that fits with his thesis of why he sort of hand waved this, is, the big difference was, they were sparsely populated. After sort of, it was, they go into that, multiple times. It's like, oh, we don't want to annex this place because we don't want the population that's already there. Northern Mexico was just fine because there were very few people there, very few non-white people there, relatively speaking.
Right.
That's why I don't think it's particularly surprising from his thesis that, he hand waved that stuff. It's it's just that when you finally get to, oh wait, we're going to bring in the Philippines, which would that's 10% of our that would be 10% of our population, and they're not white.
That was insane.
Yeah.
But along the way, though, there is still a thing, right there, and we've talked in previous books that we've read, I think I remember mentioning and kind of talking about this idea that every time somebody was going to expand it, the Louisiana Purchase, every one of these things was hotly debated, and one of the biggest points of contention was the idea that the fear of Eastern people that we are going to lose control of these folks out on the frontier, right? And especially getting towards the Mississippi and and then getting beyond the Mississippi. Holy crap! How is it that with the difficulty of travel and communication, how is it that we're going to incorporate these people as Americans? They are going to be subject to other potential world powers, France and Spain, right? They're going to develop more, or even sometimes England, right? Because Great Britain didn't stop messing around on the frontier and with the natives, and that they may fall under the sway. They may determine that they're more, that they're sort of, they have more in common with those people than with us. But also, I want to say, in not to disagree with what you're saying, Will, but as a just to put it in time, right? 1791, right, is pretty darn early, right? And that's when we get Vermont and Kentucky, and those aren't that remote. I mean, and Vermont is a knife, kind of stabbing down into this new United States from Canada, right? And there's at least some knowledge, in Philadelphia and New York, that the Vermonters, the mountain boys, Ethan Allen and his brothers, are negotiating with the English, about the status of their free republic, which is not one of the original.
And he doesn't even, very briefly on that, he doesn't even mention, I don't think, the whole bit where we attempted to annex Canada during the the Quebecers during. I was in Montreal for like a year and a half ago, and stumbled across the museum of we're Franklin, Ben Franklin went to try and negotiate and tried to the surrender of Quebec.
But
anyway, it's a but Vermont was theoretically it was a Massachusetts territory, I think, right? I don't remember about that, but
it was what?
Well, I thought Vermont actually sort of split off from. It was originally part of Massachusetts and sort of split off. Or
New York and New Hampshire. There were grants. It was called the New Hampshire Grants for a while, and what was happening was that patroons from the Hudson River Valley were coming in, and wealthy New Hampshireites were coming across the Connecticut River, and they were and so the Vermonters, the people who thought of themselves as native Vermonters, felt very kind of put upon.
But and again, another one that I thought was terrific, and again, sort of going to your point, how do we control these people? I mean, we're talking about the George Washington. The only time a sitting commander in chief actually commanded troops in the field was he went mostly because his real estate interests were being threatened.
Absolutely.
To go conquer the Western Pennsylvanians and sort of just this side of Kentucky, even, I think. But sort of that really fits in with, again, what you're talking about. He talks about it, the how do we control these people? Not so much the ethnicity issue, though there is obviously some of that, because they're not but they're not more sort of your pseudo aristocracy you already have in Virginia and the like. They are much more. And I know this from other books, there's, How the Scots-Irish Invented America. I read 25 years ago, whatever, that so much of those people who went across the Appalachia, went across the Cumberland Gap were not, we're not actually even really the same ethnicity as, as the English who owned so much of the existing 13 colonies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anyway.
And there was especially, I mean, in Vermont and Kentucky, there was probably a class, I mean, right from the get-go, kind of a class element involved. Ethan Allen gets a lot of attention in kind of secular history circles because he did write a kind of a weird book called Reason, the Only Oracle of Man. And it's it does show some I mean, he's not a wordsmith. Let's put it that way. But and it was and it got a bunch of attention at the time. But this was also the time, right? This is 1791 when this is under the first Federalist administration under Washington, right? We haven't gotten quite to the part where John Adams is really cracking down on people with Alien and Sedition Acts, but there is a kind of a growing sense, or there will in the following years there will be more of a sense that maybe this there had been Shays' Rebellion, there was this Whiskey Rebellion. Yeah, the only time that a commander-in-chief ever led troops on the field, and it was against other Americans. And then Thomas Paine leaves and goes to England, and then sails to Calais and is embraced, by the French in the early part of the Revolution, and this whole fear of kind of the export of the Revolution and it kind of getting out of control, I think is also kind of a backdrop to this. One of the things that I thought he also could have, I mean, again, I don't want to say he should have written the book that I would have written, but the Civil War is an interesting, kind of moment of empire, right? This idea that secession actually won't be tolerated, right? And this union must be preserved. For what purpose exactly? And kind of on what basis? I mean, I think a lot of times we just sort of assume that, well, of course.
Yeah. Well, at that point too, America was America long enough that there is a greater corporeal feel to it versus, he mentions Washington and Jefferson doing things to protect their own interests for their own land. Like, we got to be careful as we go further past the mountain range because I own that stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't want squatters sitting on my land. So I've got to go, so it's a specific personal motivation, whereas Abraham Lincoln doesn't have that, oh, I have a financial stake in this, so I have to do X, Y, or Z. It's not like, right now, what, 15, 20 years ago, Donald John Trump had issues with windmills being put offshore next to his golf courses.
Mm-hmm.
And that is why he's got this like vendetta against windmills for some reason. So he's literally, he's the president tilting at windmills, because he has this vendetta going back 20 years. Or he's pissed at Obama because Obama makes fun of him at the correspondence dinner. And, that becomes the motivating reason, I think, probably more than any other thing that people have been able to point to why I'm going to become president because of this thing. Because I've been slighted. I'm going to show him. But if we can't point to Abraham Lincoln and say, here's the reason why he had to keep this thing together.
I think we can, though. And I think the key to that is the Illinois Central Railroad.
Well, and maybe that's it. Did he have big money in it, though? Did he have a personal?
He and Stephen Douglas were responsible for in 1851 for the first land grant to a railroad corporation. Right, so the Illinois Central Railroad is built from Galena to Cairo, spelled Cairo but pronounced Cairo, at the bottom of the state, with a spur line to Chicago. And
in Illinois, it's more people say Cairo. Cairo is Georgia, is the weird pronunciation, I think. And I've lived near both, so the locals in Illinois
curiously,
say
in Indiana, we called it
Illinois.
Cairo also, I think. I learned it as Cairo.
Yeah. Well, in any case,
and Piru also, which will run.
Piru, nice. So, but in any case, I mean, Stephen Douglas actually drew the first checkerboard land grant map, right, where every other section, kind of in a checkerboard, would be given to the railroad company. The intervening ones would be held by the state, so that they could also be sold at a profit, once the value of the land increased with the building of the road itself, and then the towns, along the road. So I think that I mean, if Chris, in this, by the same logic that that Trump held this multi-decade, if not grudge, at least had an inclination based on his life experience. I think that it could be argued that Lincoln had an inclination based on his life experience as a Whig before becoming a Republican, that this was the way that you did things. I mean, the things that the things that the government did, that Lincoln administration did. I mean, they not only suspended habeas corpus and had an income tax, but they also, I mean, they on the good side, they had the Homestead Act and the Morrill Act, but they also did the Pacific Railroad Act, and they also destroyed state banking, right? So there's this tremendous, I think, as you've said before, right? The idea that that the War of Northern Aggression was illegitimate and was against states' rights. That argument that the South occasionally still tries to make is bogus. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that the U.S. government didn't expand hugely at the expense of both states and individuals during this period, right? Yeah. And so again, I think that's kind of the. I mean, one of my interests is kind of how this imperial, kind of boots on the ground empire idea becomes more of a mercantilist economic empire.
Well, backing slightly, because again, we've waved at it also. If we're going to talk specifically about Lincoln, I mean, his only, his formative military experience was in the Mexican-American War, and that was, and which was again actually pretty bloody, I mean, again, if that's where Grant and Lee and Lincoln and most of the people actually sort of started their experience. And I think it was the sense I get from my sense from reading Grant's memoir and hearing about I don't think that Lincoln was happy with what we did in Mexico. I don't. I could be just completely misremembering that. I may be.
He spoke on the House floor, asking specifically where the soldiers, the dozen or so soldiers that were killed, had been killed, to determine whether or not it was really in legitimate U.S. territory or even Texan territory, or if it was because it was between the Nueces and the Rio Grande, right, which was not part of original Tejas.
Yeah. Well, and again, a question actually, and again, because from what you just said, you are going to know more about you're going to know these details. I mean, my sense, my question is really more on the aftermath of it. Did he, having gone into Mexico, during the war, did he feel like, oh, in retrospect, this was just, or was this a horrible experience that we never should have done? I don't know. My guess, my super vague memory, and I guess I could just use Google like a person. But I'm not going to, again, because it sounds like you've read about it recently, is that, this was, a formative experience for him in terms of like injustice is bad. And, is that right? Am I correct in that belief or am I?
It's a really good question. I don't know as much about sort of how Lincoln felt after. I don't know that anybody has written about how Lincoln felt about the.
Googling it right now. Let's find out.
Okay, about the gains from the territorial gains from the war. I think that everybody was, I think what Immerwahr would point to is the fact that everybody didn't want Mexico City because it was filled with Mexicans.
Well, usually Lincoln is tagged more as a, Civil War era president, and that's the thing he did.
Mhm.
But given what's going on now, he also was a president who went in and slaughtered people in Minnesota and was one of the last ones to actually do that, which is a weird thing to draw with what's going on in current American politics right now.
Yeah.
So and one of the things I see as a kind of theme, at least for me in this book, is for most of these periods, America is always inventing who it wants to be as we're going through and expanding.
Mhm.
Oh, we're going to do this or we're going to change this. We're going to create an income tax law. We're going to, you know, do these things with the railroad, and it's going to be the government's going to own the land, or the government's going to give away the land, or the government's going to sell the land. And that has changed over time based on who we think we want to be.
Mhm.
I was kind of struck. I think it may have been in chapter one. Because I've been thinking a lot of Puerto Rico,
Mhm.
and he talks about Louisiana, and essentially says, oh, these people aren't smart enough
Yeah.
really to do. I think it's on page 31.
Yep.
They're not, they have a mental darkness, and they can't govern themselves, so we're going to do it for them.
Mhm.
Yet right now I think Louisiana, obviously is a state, and they would presume that they're smart enough to govern themselves, but the the state of Puerto Rico, that's not a state, has actually, I think actually right now, more people than Louisiana.
Mm.
And we say the same thing about Puerto Rico now. They're not good enough or smart enough or whatever enough to govern themselves. So we need to do it for them. And yet the population, I think I looked it up, the population of Puerto Rico right now is roughly about 4 million people,
Mm.
which puts it somewhere around 32 or 33 in terms of populations. If it were a state, it would be one of the larger states, or larger than about 20 other states.
Mhm.
And it's like, what the actual hell?
Yeah.
And really the only reason it's not a state is primarily, it's not white, to my mind, which is, I think, part of the argument he's
Yeah.
slowly building up here is these people are other, but Puerto Rico has been a part of the United States now for so long. It's not in the position of a super foreign space like the Philippines,
Mhm.
which I'm trying to follow some of his logic, but it seems like it's almost we gain this territory, but the inclination was in part, I guess, because it was so far away, we're going to give them their freedom and let them be their own thing. And it's there's not a whole lot of super clear evidence of what the history says from his perspective, why it is we let them go versus why we don't keep them as a territory,
The Philippines specifically?
you
Yeah.
know.
Well,
Yeah.
I think
Maybe a
two,
later chapter, right? Yeah.
maybe, yeah, maybe it will be, but
Philippines is 6,
okay.
Yeah.
I
So
think that,
a bunch of the battles and
which is
war
very
stuff
interesting.
is in six.
well,
Yeah.
and it continues. I mean, the thing is, and I don't think he even mentioned, I don't think he gives it enough time even in chapter 6. The Philippines insurgency, the guerrilla, I mean, it's
It's
2,800,
still going.
right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it continues for that entire decade, right?
Right.
And then McKinley, right? And and so we have a little bit of a change there. Although Teddy Roosevelt, I think is depicted accurately here. He's not interested in America minding its own business in the world, but but he has also. Yeah, so I think that if there would have been an insurgency in Puerto Rico that compared to the one in the Philippines, the outcome might have been different. And they had been at war with Spain for probably at least half a dozen years before the war breaks out in 1898. And there was, and there's probably much more public awareness of this in the same way that there was about Cuba, right? That this is kind of an ongoing revolution that has been boiling for a while. It hasn't come to a full boil yet, but everybody knows that it's been going on. And so, so at the beginning, right, the Congress extracts a concession, that Cuba will be freed, right? But that doesn't extend to the Philippines, right? And so then McKinley issues this Declaration of Benevolent Assimilation, is I think the title of his proclamation, that we're going to, and it's very much along the lines of the Rudyard Kipling poem, which also was written about this war, right? The white man's burden, right? That these people, just as you said, Chris, are not ready for the responsibilities of democracy. And so we have to,
is it that they're not ready for the responsibilities of democracy, or they're not ready to rule themselves, or they don't get how it works? And that's the question: is what level of childlikeness do these people not have to be able to do these things for themselves? Because human beings have generally been ruling themselves since, I could go, when we're talking even centuries before Sargon the Great, there have been so we're talking almost,
This gets us though back to, even again in sort of slightly earlier chapters, Indian country. When we have the Cherokee, who have completely, Europeanized, or
Absolutely.
hugely Europeanized. They have, newspaper. They've just done this, that, and the other. They're wearing suits. They're all nice and great and everything. And they actually even propose, hey, we want our own state. And it's not like legally going to be, majority. It's not like only Indians get it. But we propose to have our own state. And these guys, and it's like, no, that does not even fly. We end up with Oklahoma after being driven, not allowed to set up a state until there's a majority of white people there.
Right.
And that again, with plainly. A group of people who are plainly capable of, having a real civil, a benevolent civilization.
I think Chris was.
Well, it wasn't entirely benevolent though, because they became Georgian slave owners,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. But hey, as far as 1850s America was concerned, that was basically okay.
they're being led by a guy with a Christian name who is Christian himself.
Yeah.
And representing, and Immerwahr does kind of wave at, I don't know that he does mention that gold is discovered in Georgia. He doesn't say where, and he doesn't say that John C. Calhoun literally owns a mine in northeast Georgia. And and he's one of the significant powers in helping to push the Indians out, like, oh, there's gold here and I want it for me. So we need to get these Indians out of here. And he misses that little bit of history, but I think that's also such a small piece that no one talks about. But I totally expected Immerwahr to pick up on it, and he doesn't really, as a motivating factor.
There's a lot that's missing in this, but there is also an awful lot that is in here, and he's just foundation setting for here are the patterns. He's not getting all of the patterns. I was continually bouncing back to the index. I'm like, where is Meriwether Lewis going to show up? And it's Monica Lewinsky. So it was Lewinsky and Clark that went out and, discovered the Pacific Northwest. But it was just, there's a whole bunch of things that were not there, but he's essentially ground setting for other things that are coming. And Chris, and one of the things you said about the Philippines, with these people are not ready to rule themselves. I think the caveat to that is they're not ready to rule themselves and be subservient to us. Yeah. That's the key piece. It's like,
we
oh,
it's the
you can do fine on your own as long as you listen to us and you do what we say. And
yeah.
they
Well,
had
and
just
that's
kicked out Spain
that
for that,
that
and U.S. was like, oh, you're going to let us come in and do this, and I'm like, no, you misunderstand what we are doing here.
that paternalism of, and I always look at the framing going back 4 or 5 years now. There's some philosophy about power with, power over. There's about four, maybe five definitions of what power is with which preposition you use. And
Yeah,
in US government, it always seems to be we want to have power over something to direct
yeah,
it and force it to do kind of what we want, which is a
yeah.
sort of paternalism we need to figure out how to get rid of, because Puerto Rico could be totally capable of governing themselves, and they probably would do much better at it. The Some of the finances, because of this, governor and the board of three over the finances, is literally one of the things I think that's destroying the economics of how Puerto Rico works. Um, but the other thing too, and it's something that Colin Woodard kind of pulls in as he's kind of redefining his perspective of U.S. history in terms of his 11 nations.
Mhm.
And he looks at the kind of thesis created by Albion Seed of, as people come in, there's kind of this founder idea of what a space is or what the United States is. And most of the immigrants who move into the spaces take on the newness of what America is or is supposed to be, and they leave behind their old world feelings, which is and that's kind
Which
of
is the
what
Turner
makes
thesis.
the melting pot piece of America is you're more likely to, if you're a Vietnamese national coming to America after Vietnam, you're going to leave behind Vietnam, and you're going to, you may have bits of culture and knowledge and things that you bring with you, but you become a capitalist. You open up donut shops in Southern California. You leave behind the old thing and you become an American. And we're now just in the last, 20 years starting to see some of those Vietnamese immigrants being elected to Congress. But they now are about as dyed in the wool American as, Abraham Lincoln ever was. And the difference generally for some of these foreign territories is the people were indigenous to the place first, so they're a lot less likely. And in the case of the Philippines, when there's a lot more of them and they're so far away, it's harder to exert power over them or to move in. And even, from a Machiavellian perspective, he would say if you want to win a place over, you need to move to the place and govern from there.
Mhm.
You can't,
Well, and also Manila was a Spanish imperial city, right? And it had centuries of Catholicism and Spanish culture, and so it wasn't an indigenous, it
yeah.
wasn't the
Well,
Cherokee,
but
right?
even it's an indigenous space that's been, influenced by Spain for centuries. And then now that's the indigenous perspective. And it's definitely not an American. Like, there are not Americans living there Americanizing it or helping to
Yeah.
guide it, which makes it a whole lot tougher to rule versus Puerto Rico.
Well, and Aguinaldo was not resisting from Manila.
Yeah.
So there was
Well,
a kind of a war against the indigenous, regardless of what had happened in.
there is a geography to the Philippines that makes it immensely hard,
Yeah.
like to the level of worse than Afghanistan,
Hmm.
to try and go in and take over and
Yeah.
change the philosophy and the culture.
Right.
But that's one of the things that we see generally is we hegemonically look at a lot of these places is depending on the geography and who's there and the culture that's there, it may be so antithetical to the way of kind of American modes of life, you're never going to win. So, we go into Afghanistan and we give up roughly the same way that it took Russia, 25 or so years to decide we've got to give up here as well.
Yeah.
And the question is, what's the value here for being here versus, let's say, take a modern example of let's go invade Greenland. Okay, they're white, they're European, they're at least closer to American ideals. They have a democracy already. They're roughly, they're a first world country. So if you wanted to invade Greenland, that's a lot easier thing to take than to say, we're going to go Americanize Afghanistan or we're going to go Americanize the Philippines.
Well,
So
it'll be interesting to see what ethnicity we say they are if we do decide to go in, because I think that they could be portrayed as Europeans, having a European style of government at least, but they could also be portrayed as mostly indigenous. But I want to get back to the other thing that you said about sort of Jefferson and the whole assimilation thing, because I think that really what's coming out of this, I mean, Jefferson said assimilate. The Cherokee and the other 5 civilized tribes assimilated, to the point where, yeah, they had newspapers, they had bicameral legislatures, they had courts, they had slavery, they had everything, and they looked just like kind of browner versions of Georgians, to the west of Georgia. But Georgia and Alabama wanted to move west with cotton, by that time. And so, so you've got this kind of perfect storm of this asshole Indian fighter, Andrew Jackson, who likes that kind of thing. And John Calhoun, who's got economic interests and and all of that. And so I think where Immerwahr seems to be putting it for me is in this white supremacist framing, right?
Yeah.
That these empires are white supremacist, and that's the otherness that we're going to continue to be kind of confronted with.
Well, it's one
I
of the
think
things
there's
he doesn't. I feel like he could have pointed it out a little more strongly, and I think he just kind of glosses over it. But most of the West Coast has been turned into states, except for maybe a few places like New Mexico and Arizona. But it's literally smack dab in the center of the country is Oklahoma, where we've sent all these Indians, and they're a huge portion of the population. And Oklahoma is literally like everything around it is a sea of, logoized America, as he calls it.
Right.
And right dead center in the middle, there's this little island of Oklahoma is not a state. And to me, that's the signal of stupid embarrassment of all of the, continental US essentially, except for a few spots that just don't have enough people are states and part of the US, except for Oklahoma. And I don't think they entered until like 1906, maybe. So like we've already invaded Hawaii and started to Americanize Hawaii, and Oklahoma in the center of the country is not a state yet.
It didn't have like export access, because one of the early things in the setup was Malthusian economics.
But with Hawaii, one as a state, it's younger than me.
Oh yeah, no, it took a long time, but we've invaded it by 1905.
Yeah. But likewise, you've got the other white person in opposition within the GOP that we didn't seem to mention a while back, as in John McCain. He's not even an American. He's born in Panama, when it's not even a state or a territory in that context. So, where's the birth certificate issue? from within the GOP even to say, why is John McCarthy even a whatever congressman, senator, whatever? That's and the complexity of the process that isn't in. The one thing that I thought was with well, if I restart that, the one thing that I hadn't been aware of is that there is materially nothing in the Constitution about how to become a state, except by agreement, which, given the degree to which it has certain elements of Leviticus, as in no clothes with two fibers type equivalent of government, it seems rather odd that here we are 13 states, about to become 13 states.
Mhm.
What's a state and how do you join the club? Because, and the obvious thing to me in that context, which I don't think he said, was if you have a how to join, there must be a opposite clause of how to leave. And
Yeah, there is a how to join.
Clearly they don't want to allow for the possibility for these 13 states to suddenly become 12, 11, 10,
Right.
9.
Well, and there are
8.
several there are several sort of crises over ideas of disunion,
Yeah.
right? And it really kind of focuses on nullification, right? So Jefferson talks about nullification, then Calhoun talks about it, and Andrew Jackson, who was probably originally sort of in favor of it. By the time he gets to be president, he realizes that that's his authority that's being challenged, so he shoots it down. Right. So this idea that there are things that short of even seceding, right, there are things that the states can do to abridge the power of the federal government within their borders is being kind of contested the whole way.
Well, you can also look at it as there's a small but large experiment between the two. You can look at the individual states banding together for protection and power and commerce in the United States, and contrast that with the super multi-conglomerate of languages, cultures of most of Europe that broadly, for a long time was very Catholic and very similar, even though they were all very different. And they've all come together now, all these small state-sized entities with reasonably large populations have now become the EU.
Mhm.
And they've done so mostly for economic reasons versus doing it for military reasons because militarily there's the NATO piece and most of them are part of NATO, but they have not decided we're going to integrate our militaries to do action either against the
There's no
US, against Russia, or against some other, China or India or whatever that is. They haven't come. But those types of either coming together or falling apart, and the reasons why that happens are very similar. And so when you look at, let's say a state like Georgia might decide, oh, we want to go kind of our own direction, but they're hemmed in by what the U.S. will allow that own direction to look like.
Yeah, well, there's the obvious two Westman quotes, I suppose, given what you just said. And the reason I know that Florida didn't go to fight Germany in World War II, quote, as in the debate on Bartlett's second term. And then there's the bit where Toby and some other real famous American that didn't act his own role is helping Belarusians write their own constitution. And that in terms of how you limit and make the three-legged balance of powers work versus the original George Washington was such a nice person. We're going to elect him twice on the trot and give it to him the third time, even though he doesn't want it, type thing. um, those things all have a bearing here because of how do you move? And I'll come back to that again because I don't think it seems very odd that you've got the nth degree of the highway code of how to make a country, and yet you have no explicit mechanism for leaving or joining.
There is for joining. It's spelled out in Article 4, Section 3 of the Constitution. And all the process to join. There is no how to leave.
Right. And which doesn't, which really doesn't surprise me that much, right? Because
yeah.
I mean, early on, Jefferson's calling it, the empire of liberty and all of that. But I think really, financial incentives, I think are, play a huge kind of role in this story. Chris, you were talking about, sort of all of these territories that became states around Oklahoma, where Oklahoma remains the Indian territory for the longest time till after the turn of the century. There are huge financial incentives for that, right? There are huge annuities being paid out to these tribes. They're throwing cash at them, and there are all kinds of merchants going in there. I mean, all the way back to the really to the 1850s. Some of these primary sources that I read from this family that I studied extensively in Western Massachusetts, one of their sons goes down in 1852 to 1854, and then he disappears and they never speak of him again. So he's probably killed but he goes ultimately to the Missouri River, and then he crosses over into the Indian Territory, which he calls the land of Bowie knives. And he goes there to work at Tahlequah as this merchant that he's the store clerk for, is cashing in on these millions of dollars, even at the time, that are being kind of thrown at the native people who have nothing. Of course, there's nothing that they can spend it on except the crap that these people bring into these little stores. But there's a huge kind of financial incentive there. And then Tim, what you were talking about, Panama, again, there's a huge financial incentive to getting that, to getting Panama away from Colombia, getting that canal built, and then us owning it and controlling it until Jimmy Carter decided to give it back.
Yeah, with Oklahoma, there was also part of the setup in like the first couple chapters of there's the Malthusian economics of being able to feed everybody and running the math on that. There was access to export, ease of access. In Oklahoma being in the middle and there's not a navigable river around it.
Right.
It's sort of stranded. And it also didn't have an awful lot of, natural resources. I'm forgetting the third. I couldn't find it. I didn't have it highlighted. But it's like those were sort of the three things for, hey, does this make sense for us? Yeah, we're going to go grab this. We'll take this and then, throw the people we don't want into Oklahoma.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's garbage land. Yeah. That there's no reason to go to. It's not Kansas, the Kansas gold rush, at Pikes Peak, when that was part of the Kansas Territory in 1859, it kind of those are the things that kind of focus a spotlight on an area, right? Or the also 1859 silver rush in Virginia City, So yeah, so there are these places that are, kind of the focus of attention and are considered to be important. And then there's this kind of worthless, backwater that
That's not economically productive, and but that's exactly why we put them there, is
yeah,
because it was not economically productive.
right,
And even worse is they were economically productive in the place that they were.
right.
They had livings, and in particularly in indigenous cultures, it's your you're being tied to the land and the things you've done for the land. So
Mhm.
it's kind of like, they move into some of these other Western Indian territories that the trees have been cleared and manicured. So it's these verdant grasslands, and it's this all this great farmland. Well, it's because the Indians were,
Absolutely.
creating that.
Right.
Yeah.
I One of the things that I really killed me, and I had read nothing about it, and it always amazes me, these pieces of history that you don't hear about, they're not talked about, but the chapter on the fact that there's a chapter on Guano Islands in this book
I love that. Yep.
just thrilled me to death. But I can't help but look at, they're essentially, you know, real estate corporations sold this dream of California to Oklahomans to move out,
Yeah.
and there's all kinds of opportunity, and it would just a total sham. And in the same way, these corporations who really don't have, they've been given the blanket legal authority to go to islands, but that the fact that they've almost got to conscript people and kidnap them to go and do this work. And then they're surprised when they revolt. And the thing that really kills me in the history as he presents it here is it's not a story of a corporation committing a massive scale fraud on these people that they're roughly kidnapping to force into labor camps, and then force them to spend the entirety of their earnings on beds and food to actually live once they're there. But it becomes a question of, does the company have standing there? And then the bigger question is, then does the US government, is it government there if there's no government there? And so it goes to the Supreme Court, and the question is totally not about the fraud that was perpetrated on these people that caused them to revolt, but it's about how does the US government have power or not in this place? And to me, that is just the biggest, like, logical fallacy of the entirety of the process. It's, the focus should have been on, can a corporation get away with doing this, thing to people and perpetrate fraud? And nobody seems to care about this in the way the history is presented here.
Well,
And I like that, to me, that is like the stake in the heart for all of this processes. It's all more about US power over the people instead of power with them, or what, government should be looking out for its people.
mhm.
And I think the other piece that's missing is not government looking out for its people, but it's how are we defining who its people really are. And
Yeah.
if they're black or they're brown, then you're not our people. It doesn't matter what your philosophy
I'm,
or ideas are. If you're part of us, you want to be part of us or not.
I'm, I'm sorry. I'm, I'm sorry. You still believe that constitution for the people, by the people? Are you really that?
I no, I admit that it's totally wrong, and we have been. And if you watch a lot of American struggle, you know, um, do it do it by, there's a phrase that Jesus says, bring me the least of you, and that's how you can judge a people, is who are the least. So if you take an elderly African American woman, and I know, if you really want to make it super crazy, make them non-gender
No,
binary or trans. and how do we treat those people? And those are like the smallest, tiniest minority that are the most beat up on. And how do we treat those people, which in a Christian nation, they ought to be kings and queens among us like everyone else, and we totally don't. So there's this promise of we the people,
Mm.
and we're taking 250 plus years to try and fulfill that idea of that promise, but it's a lot of it. Yeah, a lot of it's lip service for
taking your example, especially in the context of recent UK legal changes. October, November, might have been earlier. A certain person with money who is otherwise not really engaged has somehow picked up on a problem and has used various activists and campaigners to get the law changed in the UK such that trans women don't have access to the ladies' toilet in the UK legally now, right? And when that truth gets pointed out, that this moneyed person who has been on the wrong end of with money and no money, so should actually know better, then sides against the least of the least, as you've used the phrase, is pointed out as being such a little shit, as in J.K. Rowling, the do-gooders fan club makes so much noise that that person gets pushed off up to 9 bits of social media because they dare say that J.K. is a bad person because of his siding against the least of the least of the least in a, albeit not a declared Christian country, but we head of state is also head of the church.
Well, you do have an established
etc.,
church.
etc., etc.
Yeah.
So that sort of power goes a long way. And yet that ultimate power in the UK has turned on brother because he's a paedophile without almost any conversation seemingly going on in public other than the accusations, etc., and payouts, etc. And now poor Prince Andrew is no longer Prince. And therefore his kids no longer get stuff.
Okay.
But so it works. But yeah, for the people of the people seems literally going back to the earlier part of this book and before everybody else turned up, started chatting with Dan. The Daniel Boone character in the first chapter or so of this book, I conflated badly with Bowie in Texas. I'm thinking, well, hang on a minute, what happened? And so I've got one of the things that I'm sure we all suffer with is things we know about on the periphery. So I'm trying to join up the Siege of the Alamo with the Last of the Mohicans and pushing them together, missing entirely the next chapter, as in your Civil War.
And it plays into the white supremacist, white hero of the frontier, kind of
thing.
And he's also a topic that's been heavily Disneyfied too.
Oh yeah.
In terms of who he was and how and
absolutely. I mean,
totally Disneyfied.
I was committing the sin of sin the other day. I was actually humming the the Crow song in Dumbo that I actually quite like. It's one of the first things I can remember doing as a kid. And of course, 20 plus years later, the film that I saw after that from Disney was Song of the South, because that's the sequence, right? And of course, that now is off the catalogue and you can't get it. And you know, Little Bluebird on My Shoulder is certainly not a song to sing when you walk through the black area, right? But the Crow song for Dumbo is clearly my favourite film, if only because of the mouth, right? So,
Okay.
so it was odd to me not knowing about Oklahoma as a process attached to the bits that I do know about, fictional or otherwise, as in Mel Gibson's film Revolution, whatever it was, Patriot rather, The Last of the Mohicans, and those bits of history that are in and around there with the Trenton beating of the Hanoverians, etc. All of that conflating down to, hang on a minute, this isn't Bowie, this is Daniel Boone, who's somebody else. And I can't remember him in fictional terms, stroke the Disney-fied type history that we all get. Don't know why, but clearly Daniel Boone, frontiersman, guy walking around in a deerskin suit. I vaguely remember, but I don't really have a context for it. I was somewhat amazed at the way that the territory, the Oklahoma territory, or the Indian territory rather, and then Oklahoma territory before it became a state, was so different and such a big chunk. But in the conversation, in the reading of this and the conversation, we're talking about where's the balance of money to population to resources that we are exploiting now versus we can exploit later, with or without a train set, because it's nowhere near a coast, etc. Which obviously in part, Europe has a much better geographical win. For Spain's got a lot of coast and can get to Manila quite happily, which they did pre-1600.
Right. Well, so can I take it a little bit back to this idea of the West Coast, right? Because yeah, I mean, Oklahoma is very remote, and it kind of makes sense to me why it is this sort of dumping ground for unwanted people during that whole era before there was just no land left, and so the Sooners all lined up at the border and raced in. But the West Coast, one of my dissertation advisors was a guy, he was much younger than me, at Amherst College, named Ted Malillo, who wrote his first book. His Yale dissertation that became his first book was called Strangers from Another Land, or something like that, or strangers from, and the point was, it was a comparison of California and Chile, and how they were the same. They were really the same place. They were Mediterranean climate on the west coast of of their continents on the Pacific Ocean, and this kind of goes back to that conversation we were having about the Chincha Island Wars and the Guano era, right? So in the 1840s, late 1840s, early 1850s, this guano is discovered. The British and the dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica was an interesting. That I had never heard it described that way. That was very interesting. And they do make a huge claim in Antarctica. The Chileans do, but they the Chileans, then became the part that he doesn't talk about, because he jumps right from the Guano era, with just a brief mention of Atacama Desert nitrate to the Haber-Bosch process, right? And Fritz Haber and his great aunt, Clara, and which is a great story, and is also, I think, Václav Smil wrote about it in several books. He gave a huge part of making the 20th century to it, and then I think and then subsequently he wrote a whole book about the Haber-Bosch process. But the thing is that this is an empire on the West Coast that America runs up against. So I don't think that we should imagine America as as having completed the Mexican-American War and the Civil War, and then just it's all glory and easy. And also, to think about the motivations for going after Spain in 1898, right? What happened in the intervening years was that there's a Chincha Island war, for possession of the Chincha Islands off the coast of Peru, which is where most of the nitrate is. And then about simultaneously, America passes the Guano Islands Act and gives these bonuses to sailors who plant an American flag on an uninhabited island that has guano on it. And we do get a lot of islands that way. We get Midway that way. We get part of the Hawaiian chain that way. And, but then the action shifts from guano to caliche, which is this nitrate that's a foot or two under the ground in the Atacama Desert. And then, because this becomes so valuable, because nitrate really is, and he just kind of mentions in passing that, oh, by the way, they discovered that nitrate was useful for explosives. That wasn't just a haphazard discovery. That was one of the main reasons, from the very beginning, why nitrate was so valuable and sought after. And the British, in the late 1870s, the Chileans fight a war, the War of the Pacific, against the Bolivians and the Peruvians, and they win, and they take away this desert and all of this nitrate from, because it was what's now called the Norte Grande was Bolivia and Peru. And Bolivia had Pacific port. They had Arica, and they lost it in this war, and they still sing songs about it in Arica. How the ethnic Bolivians think someday they'll get it back, and the Chileans in the meantime have granted them free port access. But so there's this war that's fought in around 1878, and as a result of this war, Chile becomes the power on the West Coast of the Americas. Right? And they can extend that power all the way to San Francisco. And the Esmeralda, their flagship, basically rules the waves. And this also is a huge, I think, it's a story that only Ted and a couple of other people have ever really told about this. We tend to think of America and American culture, and that whole Frederick Jackson Turner thesis, right? That we come from the East, we come from Europe, we go to the frontier, we get all of this Europeanness washed off of us, and we become real Americans. But it's a very East to West trajectory, right? And Ted kind of points out that, well, wait a minute, there's this thing going on in California. And part of it has to do with Asia, but part of it also has to do with Chile, right? Alfalfa comes into America as a fodder crop by way of Chile, right? It's, they tried it as they called it lucerne grass in New England, but the conditions weren't right. It was too wet and cold and it didn't grow. But then then Chilean miners bring it in, because the Chilean miners are a bunch, they're the people who kind of work the mines during the California gold rush as well, because they know mines, right? They've been mining copper in Chile and processing it for generations, for centuries by that point, right? And so they're really, kind of instrumental in the growth of California. And apparently there is a building, I don't know if it's the Transamerica Tower, there's a kind of an urban rumor that, that if you go in the basement of the Transamerica Tower or some other big building in San Francisco, there's like a little door that you can open and you can kind of look through it at the the bones under the foundation. And the bones under the foundation of San Francisco are Chilean ships that have been basically sunk to provide a stable footing.
Foundation.
So,
Well,
so
you're totally, erasing the efforts of Junipero Serra, in the story here.
my parents
Daniel.
did the mission trail once when they first moved to California.
Like there was
But even that was
there was a
centuries
Camino
after.
Real that
Yeah, the California. I mean, they were in the late 18th, early 19th century almost, right? By the time that those missions were getting established, right? So California had been part of New Spain for centuries before that.
Mhm.
So there's this long history. I mean, it's almost like when I meet with Latin American historians, there's a big differentiation. Are you a colonial or a post-colonial Latin American historian? Because it's so there's so much, and so people typically choose that. The same could be said about New Spain, right? But it isn't, right? Because we think, oh, California, 1849. That's where it all began, or Junipero Serra, right? And the missions is where it all began. But I think it's interesting that the whole. I mean, I like the stuff that he talks about. I like the fact that he did devote a chapter to nitrate, which he's right, and he's directly channeling Václav Smil when he says, we could only have 2 billion people if it wasn't for nitrate.
Well, he only, tangentially mentions his familial connection.
Yeah.
Although I gotta imagine he's a little pissed that the family fortunes did not probably fall on his shoulders as a result of all this business. But it's Fritz Haber. I don't know how much he actually got. I mean, he got huge prestige out of it, but I think Haber died of complications of heart disease. Fritz Haber did on his way to migrating to Palestine in the mid 1930s, before the Second World War, before Hitler really started, kind of being known to be, kind of going after German Jews and European Jews in general. His son, of course, their son, Clara and Fritz's son, is only about he's between 8 and 12 years old, I think, when she kills herself. And then, of course, later on, he will also kill himself based on discovery, his discovery after the Second World War, that, Zyklon B, which was kind of derived from Zyklon A that his father had produced, was responsible for the gas chambers at the concentration camps. So tragic family history. As I look at the cover of our book, I'm really struck too that this map that's on it.
Yep.
Alaska is this tiny ass little bump on the ass of America in this thing, when in reality, landmass wise, it's a quarter of the entire continental United States. It's a really big place.
Yep.
So we always have a problem too when we look at political maps of America, when you see the red states versus blue states. It totally it looks as if we're ruled by landmass, when generally and it's not great based on.
It's the accurate. I assume that's the accurate size, right?
I think that's even still a little on the small side. It's closer, but I think it's still a little on the small side. I think if you overlay it, it goes almost.
Well, I suppose you have to account for map projection, so we could go back to the West Wing there.
But we always think of the right especially gets super upset because they say, oh, we should have won. And when you look at this big red map, but we're not ruled by landmass, we're ruled by population.
Yeah, right.
But that also pisses me off even more, that we've got such a huge population in Puerto Rico that just, they get a representative without a vote when they probably should have four or five, you know, representatives in the House and two in the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
But we
Just
can't
like
let we
Washington,
can't
D.C.
do that because that would throw, that would give the
That would
Democrats
upset the
way too much
balance.
power.
The balance that needs to be carefully maintained. Yep. Yep.
And they're
So
also mostly not white.
yeah,
That's the important thing.
right. No, they definitely are. Yeah, I remember. I mean, I remember being a kid and being just fascinated by Daniel Boone, right? And this the idea of kind of crossing over the Cumberland Gap and
Well, that's
and being captured and then being tortured, but then being adopted. You know,
that's one of the things that strikes me too is there's the history of Washington Irving, early big bestseller
hmm
is essentially responsible for the idea that Columbus thought the earth may have been flat and you could sail off the map because
right.
he wrote that in a best-selling book and that myth has stuck with us.
Yeah.
And then to see the history here of, and you may read some of the Indian stories that he wrote, but what's his
Cooper.
name? Cooper, and the stories he wrote after that impact kind of that Daniel Boone mythology
hmm
is fascinating.
Yeah.
But then what kills me is somehow Mark Twain doesn't seem to be able to catch on to that. And it's all his quiet personal writings that aren't released until the 60s. And I can't help but wonder if Twain in his later life had written some popular stories that helped take his political perspective and create a new American mythology,
I think Innocents Abroad tries to do that.
you know. Yeah, some of his later stuff does a little bit, but it just, it doesn't see, we don't see the impact of it, decades later on. We still see the Huck and Jim thing still is playing out, as evidenced by this retelling,
Right.
what, a year and a half, 2 years ago,
Mhm.
Percival James comes out and it's still part of the zeitgeist.
Yeah.
I mean, it is interesting. I mean, that was again one thing that sort of again, I don't know enough about the actual truth here, but he does say that Twain later on was very vocal in his opposition to empire. It's just they said he couldn't get any traction. Like like he wasn't like hiding this stuff. He couldn't get it published. But he was the most popular writer in America. I don't actually know what happened there, and I'm curious. If anybody, if any of us here do.
Well, he had essentially his own publishing company, an army of salesmen, because he was the guy behind Grant's biography being the biggest one, and still even in raw numbers is still a massive bestseller.
Well, I mean, that wasn't his. That was the Grand Army of the Republic people, and it was for a specific, it was for a specific thing. I mean, I don't think those guys went around selling Twain books.
Yeah, well,
I mean,
he probably sold a few more books because of that than he might have otherwise.
but I mean, anyway. But I mean, again, and then we're talking, 20, that imperial, the autobiography, Grant's memoirs, were written and published in 20 years before this empire stuff really, before the thing that the Twain is really objecting to, which is the early 1900, the 1901, 1902, the Spanish American War stuff, resolution to that. So was he passe by that point? I don't know. But why he couldn't, again, why he couldn't get that public, or why there wasn't any traction, I just don't know. And I find it interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, he was living in
I'm
Hartford by then, right? So
Yeah,
Mhm.
by the early 1900s, he's in Connecticut.
yeah.
Yeah.
So he's probably sort of ensconced in kind of a comfortable social milieu that he doesn't necessarily want to burn down. his
Well, he's
relationship.
publishing. I mean, he is. I mean, again, he guy does mention he is publishing this stuff. It's just not getting any traction. He's saying, "Oh, this is what the flag of this is what our flag ought to be." He's saying that publicly,
Right.
and he's vastly wealthy. I just don't think he can get any. But had America turned away from Twain? Was America turning away from Twain because of his age? Because at this point he's already quite elderly, or because they just didn't like what he was saying? We were like,
Yes.
pretending.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
The
I mean,
book
if you
implies
think
the
about
latter.
if you think about the press, right? You go from an era, a Civil War era where you've got, these abolitionist idealists like Horace Greeley, right, in New York. But by the time that we get to the Spanish-American War, what have we got? We've got Hearst and Pulitzer, who are both, very much on the side of this imperial project. And so, yeah, so what outlet would he have, would Twain have
Where's
had?
where's the Hearst Prize? We have all these influential people. Like we have a Twain Prize, we have a Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah.
Hearst's problem apparently was that he just didn't institute
Publicist.
a prize for something.
Yeah, maybe, I guess, but yeah.
But reading this and watching the history unfold, I kind of wish I had a better pulse on what kind of average Americans' viewpoints were on these things. And you only get small examples of, okay, here's what Twain thought
Mhm.
potentially because he was writing, but you don't get the broader, here's what most of the rest of America thought. The way, and we don't get it the way it's really broad spread now. Something can happen in Palestine and you'll hear and know through social media what people think in general about it or want to be angry about it. But it's interesting to juxtapose all these political things playing out in their day when no one knows what's going to happen, even though in retrospect, now looking back, we can see what the results were. But then putting yourself in that same position and saying, okay, now I'm living in this time and these similar things are still happening. We're trying to, I think it's interesting that we're reading this as, there's talk about invading Greenland or Iceland, depending on who you want to believe on any given week, or whether we should be having hegemony over what's happening in Palestine or what's happening in, hey, I've heard whispers of, hey, let's take back the Suez Canal, like these ideas that just have been around for a long time, or we own them before and we should own them again, and you know.
We threw the Suez Canal.
Well, I mean,
Well, that was
does-
one of the things in the last month, as Trump says, "Oh no, Greenland was ours before, and we
Yeah.
gave it away." Like
Right.
these falsehoods of what actually really happened, and who can you believe?
It was a bad
You know.
deal. We got screwed. Well,
But
it's kind of funny because the other thing I'm sorry, go ahead, Will.
Well, I mean, it does speak a little, Chris. I mean, about an important sort of technological thing that I think is happening around the turn of the century. We mentioned Pulitzer and Hearst. That we have the consolidation of the news media then.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously we had a rather we had a very long period of consolidation of the news media, basically up until the internet,
Yeah.
or roughly
mean,
coinciding with the end of the Cold War, when sort of, anyway, but yeah.
you go 2 generations before that, and even Benjamin Franklin, like that was his platform.
Yeah.
That was his base of power, was newspapers.
Oh, absolutely.
But there's consolidation of it where you got like.
Mm-hmm. But then it's disrupted again,
Yeah.
by radio, and then that consolidates, and it's disrupted again by TV, and that consolidates. So there's pattern, or there's cycles. But I think the main thing that I like about this whole moment that we're kind of getting to at the beginning of the 20th century is there's so much happening. right? I was also reminded, kind of when you were talking, Chris, of there's another one of those Heather Cox books. I think it's Wounded Knee, right, where she tries to kind of create this literary metaphor moment at the beginning of Wounded Knee, where she talks about this wind, this storm wind, or something that's blowing over, the Dakotas that will, a week later, blow this dust over Washington D.C. or something. She's trying to kind of connect the two things, and that's one of the that's one of the interesting metaphors, I think, is that there's so much going on, right? Because Wounded Knee is also, happening during this same period. And I was thinking about that while I was watching 1883 the other night, right? That, okay, wait a minute, this is a couple of years before Wounded Knee. And they kind of wave, along the way, the Crow and the Dakota and the Lakota up in up there are going crazy, and as well they should. They're justified in their complaints and all that. But all of this stuff is kind of happening more or less simultaneously. And at the same time, Frederick Jackson Turner, at age 20 or whatever, is going, to the Columbian Exposition, and is kind of laying out his ideas about the closing of the frontier. At the same time that we're looking at Panama, and filibusters are going down, and he only kind of waves at the filibusters, right? But there's that whole, this whole kind of idea that we're going to somehow go down and liberate these republics that were established, several generations earlier, at the end of the real kind of large extent of the Spanish Empire. So all these things probably, kind of relate to each other in ways that, because we sort of focus on, one of them or the other, depending on our, or our subdiscipline as historians, whether we're looking at Native Americans, or we're looking at environmental history, or we're looking at, political history,
Yeah.
and
Well,
overseas.
the interesting piece too is how we see the things happening in the moment, and that creates not only a perception for us, but a perception for our kids and our kids' kids that grows. We've spent a fair amount of time reading books where American mythology is a big piece. And how do you unpack those mythologies to get at the truth? And I think it's kind of very telling. I think it was in the introduction, he said that, this book's main contribution is not archival in terms of like telling the story. And a lot of it is stories that have been long forgotten, or just the average American has no idea.
Mhm.
I don't think Harry and Mary Beercan could not tell you America's relationship with Guano
And the
Islands,
Chincha Islands War, yeah.
but he says it's not archival, it's perspectival, and seeing kind of a familiar history in a different way. But the question is, how easy or hard is it for a book like this to kind of, it may change the perspective of the six of us who read it, and maybe, if he's lucky, 100,000 other people. I
Mhm.
don't, this copy I got from the library is, I'm sure it's no, actually it's mine is a third printing of this book. So maybe it went to 30 or 40,000 copies,
Mhm.
but of that, maybe a quarter of them got perused or read. So how long does it take for a book like this to really help shift that perspective of looking back at the history? Because he's also looking at, he's looking at 250 plus years of what has happened and where are we going. And my guess is he doesn't even at the end get into now that we know this, where should we go from here? Or how do we prescriptively change the rudder of the ship to go in a better direction? It's hard enough to pack in as much history as all of us would want him to, and still clock it in under 500 pages.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, but he is pulling some interesting, yeah, as you say, kind of lesser known, kind of vignettes and kind of stitching them into this fabric that I think is good. It's good to attempt it, even
yeah.
if we don't
Well,
necessarily. He
even
kind of
reading
pulls it
that,
off.
was super excited to read the introduction, and I was like, I don't know how he's going to pull off
Yeah,
all this stuff inside of 500 pages, because that introduction really is,
yeah, yeah. But again, remember,
hey, I'm going to do something here.
another one of
Well,
these many things that's. Go ahead, Tim.
the introduction, as it happens, is virtually verbatim his various TV interviews and various podcasts
Right.
of the book. So the intro is almost covering the whole thing, and again, going back to the minute or so that we had before everybody turned up, the to-ing and fro-ing on the Day of Infamy speech, I found very illuminating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I had a certain feel, and it's again one of those timeline things. Until you put disparate things down on a timeline, it's like, so okay, so when did Malaya get invaded by Japan? The day after Pearl Harbor, right? I know Malaya got invaded, and I know 3-4 months later Singapore fell, etc., etc. But it's the exact juxtaposition of when, and it's the same. I think in many people's cases for World War II type stuff, as in the 6th of June the invasion of Normandy is the point at which the war turned. Now, the point at which the war turned effectively was when we all went up, leaving North Africa and entering into Sicily and then into Italy, which was a few months before.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there's that separation of stuff happening unless you either take a very globalist, I've got a 1-volume book, World War II, which isn't even really World War II because it's World War II in Europe from September 39 type thing.
So no
And
Manchuria.
the other thing that I keep bumping up against, way my school history went, we kept every year or every school that we changed. You started back at the Romans and you sort of went forward and depending on how fast you went, you got to Magna Carta or you didn't. And if you were really lucky, you got to know what Tyler was. But because I didn't do history as a choice, because I did all the science and the maths instead, what we now talk about as the War of Three Countries, i.e. England, Scotland and Ireland, as Civil War One, Civil War Two, basically, for the UK, for England, stroke the UK, stroke Great Britain. There's a bit in the middle where we weren't fighting each other, but it turns out we, royal, and we, parliamentarian, were on the opposite side of a French-Dutch war. So there's a battle called the Battle of the Dunes, which I knew nothing about until a few months ago. And the royalist regiment for that is what's now known as the Blues and Royal. And they were up against some of the other, what we now think of as the household regiments from the parliamentarian side. And rather like we've spoken briefly about Constitution controlling the three legs of the governments here, one of a few things that we seem to have done in advance of you guys was making the army answerable to Parliament by controlling its money and taking the royal family out in the main. Mainly because the people either side of a civil war, royals-wise, were too expensive with the money and not good enough accountants, basically. And that came over as an odd one in the sense of who were we then fighting in and around that time. And we were periodically against the Spanish, against the French, and particularly against the Dutch, because we want the Spice Islands and trade and stuff. And then, of course, by the time you get to 1600, we're with the Dutch against the Spanish and the Portuguese over what? Over the Philippines and Japan and China trade. All of which comes back to elements of this. But the sweeping statements never seem to have enough detail.
Oh, yeah.
But the battle by battle type detail elements, not you have too much detail and don't necessarily give you correct context.
No, you're right. You're right. I wasn't. I was not at all on my radar personally that the British and Dutch are not really kind of allies in the entire period from 1588 to to through the the 1610s. Obviously, the Puritans who become the Pilgrims are living in Leiden, right? And so the idea that these alliances sort of come and go based on based on what else they're facing, whether it's France or Spain. It's very interesting.
This swinging back and forth, as in we all sort of know, Nelson did his thing at Trafalgar against Napoleon. What was Nelson's other really big success? The bombardment of Copenhagen.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yep.
Right. So and I think of that in the same way as I think of Washington, as in this young whatever lieutenant, I suppose, in the Indian-French wars, makes the mistake of shooting the diplomatic mission from France, and therefore kicks off the Indian-French War. As a Brit, he's clearly a Brit from a place called Washington in Lincolnshire, etc., 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 and then flips. Obviously, wants to become his own Republican thing. So those. Rather like Chris is saying about what do we think of it now? Is Trump's ultimate downfall down to 6 guys from ICE pull out a gun and shoot 11 bullets into a body? Or is it going to be the Epstein files? Or is it he can't put his hand in his own pocket to buy Greenland? Or with any luck, it's going to be the plain, clear, utter success of the reading that came out this weekend.
What was that? The last thing?
Melania.
Oh. Okay.
It's not going to be till tomorrow morning until we have enough data from the theatrical release to.
All right. No,
well, I guess that's the thing. Between our meeting last week and our meeting this week, a lot happened.
There's a bunch of news reports about how good it's doing in the UK.
Oh, lovely.
Oh, my early stories were that only 1 or 2 tickets had sold in pre-sales leading up to Wednesday, Thursday. And they were really, really worried it was going to just totally miserably fail.
Mm.
Yeah, there were
Yeah.
supposedly only
Well,
two theaters that had
there's one.
pre-sales.
There's,
Yeah.
there's one news story where there was 11 people watching the film,
Wow.
10 of whom were sent there as journalists, and the 11th person was a friend of one of the producer people. Um,
Yeah.
And the other good one I've seen is some cinemas have changed because obviously because of the big multiplexes, you got the 500 seat, the 200 seat, the 50 seats, and the 20 seat ones. One cinema in the UK has pushed it out to a portaloo, so there's one seat with a TV size screen, and they're wondering whether they're going to be able to sell the seats for that.
Well,
But the context, and I suppose the engineering background shows. I like it when you know the context in one situation and it changes in the next one because of a technology change. So the example, obviously, we go back to the Harbour process and the Guano Islands stuff. The whole thing shifts. And then, of course, what's the consequence of that? Because I can now make fertilizer, not explosive, fertilizer becomes dirt cheap because there's all the World War One and then World War Two expansion industrially. That's why fertilizer is so cheap, and that's why we have fertilizers on farms. And the same goes for pesticides. Because as he says in one of the interviews, rather than the book that I've got so far, there is the guy that did the Puerto Rico medicine period where he kills a couple of people to see what happens.
Mm.
There's elements of that echo Nazi German and Imperial Japanese war crimes of experimenting on those people in their various camps.
Mm-hmm.
All those medical advances gained from that all then become tarnished if you know about them. And obviously, in the terms of Puerto Rico, people didn't know about them until much later.
Mm-hmm.
There's no war to worry about, so there's no war crimes. And now, of course, it's analogous, I suppose, to the fact that you've got the likes of Alan Shepard in the black women doing the calculations for NASA, saying, well, if Catherine says so, I'll get on and we can take off.
Right, yeah.
You would never think somebody that's working out of Alabama, as in Huntsville, would want a black woman to confirm that he will come back safely. He'd want one of the Nazis to do it, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's so much, right? There's kind of so much that goes into this whole thing. The next batch of chapters that we're going to read, which
Mm-hmm.
are up to the end of part one, right, to the beginning of this pointillist empire thing that we're going to start in part two, seem to be equally, I don't know, I've just kind of glanced at them. They seem to be sort of equally sort of vignettes that are kind of scene setting for the big thing. And it continues. We continue in Manila. The last chapter is of the chapter 12, I guess it must be. You know, there are times when men have to die. Is another Second World War. I mean, it kind of returns to MacArthur and the Second World War, and
he's probably going to tell us why we gave why we decided to give the Philippines back.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
That's probably where this is really eventually going.
Well, I think
Mhm.
yeah, and I would guess, I mean, just based on what I've read about it before reading this, I would guess that it has a lot to do with although ironically, a similar thing happened in Vietnam, right? There was a very legitimate resistance to the occupation, the Japanese occupation, that worked hand in hand with the OSS, and I think by the end of my sense of the Second World War and kind of war news and propaganda, in the contiguous 48 in America, was that these people, the Filipino resistance was seen as epic. Right? I've seen posters of Filipinos with bayonets, just like looking like they were ready to go, and there was all of this buildup of kind of support. These Filipinos, they're kind of quasi-American and all that, in a way that there wasn't, of course, for Vietnam, where there was also a huge resistance that was organized by Ho Chi Minh, actually.
Wait, are you implying that they're quasi-American because they're holding guns?
That they're on our side. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
They're like our little brothers.
But here's the thing. But very, very quickly, remember, in Vietnam, we actually ended. In Vietnam, the French actually gave weapons back to the Japanese to help keep the Vietnamese back.
They did, those bastards.
Yeah.
Yeah. They totally did. Yeah.
After the surrender of the Japanese. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. They armed prisoners of war to pacify the Vietnamese. Yeah. That was that's hard to come back from. Yeah. But the whole. I mean, I think that and you were talking. Who was talking? Tim. You were talking about kind of the moment is when we kind of squeeze from in Africa from the east and the west, and the Germans kind of flee up through Sicily and Italy, and kind of back to the soft underbelly of Europe, which turned out not to be so soft, right? Although Churchill promised Roosevelt it would be, right? And this Allied invasion of Italy, the thing that we forget about there, because at that point America starts thinking of the Italians as our plucky little brothers, right? Who are kind of who have come around and they're on our side now, and we never tell the story of the division of Italy. Right, from Rome south, the Italians embraced the Americans, right, and welcomed them and helped them. They captured Mussolini. He got away with the help of the Germans, and he established a fascist state in northern Italy that kind of blocked our entry into the Alps, and so I mean, they gotta fight their way, hill by hill through the Apennines, and then up into the mountains, and but we never tell this story because, of course, those what's up in the north of Italy? Well, Milan and Turin, right, and the industrial centers, and the financial centers, and everything that we want to say was working with us when they weren't. They were working against us for quite a long time. But that's not a convenient story. So I don't know. It's interesting. The other thing, I mean, the thing really that I don't know that I got out of these chapters was really kind of the laying the foundation, laying the financial foundation for kind of a lot of these financial imperial things that are going to happen. Because remember the other, that period around, the first decade of the 20th century, so, Teddy Roosevelt is launching the Great White Fleet, and it's sailing around the world. And, and the American Fruit Company is establishing itself as the biggest landowner in Latin America, right? And that runs the post offices and the radio stations and, tourism and everything, right? And then, and then owns so much land that, that when locally elected, democratic governments decide they want to do something resembling land reform, they can scream communist and bring in the Americans, either through gunboat diplomacy or later on through, CIA-sponsored covert actions and coups. things like that. So this all it's all. I mean, the pieces are all kind of getting put on the chessboard at this point. So the rest, I'm looking forward to reading the rest of it.
It's nice reading good writing and not Pinker.
Yes.
Yes. It's easier to listen to as well. Too, I've
Is it?
been sort of bouncing back and forth between listening to it first and then kind of reading through it. And yeah, it's
I've been appreciating sort of the whatever the dessert in each chapter, right? Like it's just like, oh, and now we're moving to the next chapter. I can feel it.
Yeah.
For an episodic reader is helpful.
Yeah. Well, and I didn't mind at all the moment I knew he was going to drop that bomb about, this is my great aunt,
Yeah.
at the very end of that chapter, but it was still, it was a good payoff,
Exactly.
It worked. Yeah. So, yeah, it's a tragic, that is a tragic family story. Holy crap.
Well, it's also a tough thing to say, hey, I had this uncle who created, biological weapons.
Yeah. I didn't realize the detail in here, where he talks about how
Chemical weapons.
the people who were the actual victims. I knew that it was in April 1915 at Ypres, but I didn't know, who actually the gas was released on. So that was kind of a useful detail for me to add to my list of things that I talk about when I talk about that.
I think what shocks me though is some of these pivotal big pieces of history that just we don't talk about ever. Like just the amount of effect of like Guano Islands on US history, or even the fact that it was the kind of thing that would come up in the State of the Union multiple times, and chunks of elections turned on whether or not we were, mining batshit, in the Pacific, and how that works and why.
Yeah. Not to mention the Battle of Midway.
Or how that affects like what the U.S. government has power over or not because of, quirky little words that are written into these laws that,
Or not even necessarily laws. Just opinions. That's sort of the insular, that insular
Insular
rule
laws was fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, where it's foreign except in a domestic way, or maybe I've got it backwards. Domestic, but in a foreign way. I forget what. And
right. Yes. Yeah.
But I knew about the insular situation as in the context of Puerto Rico a little bit, because you can't miss that, particularly when you live in New York City. But it's local politics. But yeah, again, the little facts of that history of that I didn't really get, or for the one that really jumped out at me more than anything was, and he just sort of blows past it really quickly. The Dominican Republic offered to sell itself to us.
Yeah.
Yes.
Who is
They
getting
said,
the
no.
money?
Why would we buy them? We don't want all these. I think the response from he uses the N word. It goes right back to the whole. And I think that's one of the through lines in this also is you go back to the whole gerrymandering. Is sort of politicians choosing their voters rather than the other way around. So. Yeah.
Right.
And we're choosing our citizens instead of the citizens choosing us. Is sort of that consistent.
Well, and the other
probably
problem,
a counterfactual somewhere though about the DR purchase, and then how Haiti would have been a different story.
That's exactly what I was going to say. The problem with the DR purchase is that Haiti is next door, and Haiti's been a problem for us right from the beginning.
But if we
another thing that happened in 1791,
what if we'd really helped them? What if they'd become a state and we'd help them?
Yeah.
Or just worked with, or told the French, no, you can't, force, Haiti to have, billions in 1800 money.
Right. Reparations.
Because, you dared free yourselves. So you have to reimburse us for the price of not being your slaves anymore,
Right. Right. And it's not even, and France isn't even France, right? So it's sort of like, well, wait a minute. What is this historical continuity? It was the French monarchy that lost Haiti, and then Napoleon's empire tried to regain it, and now the Haitians are still paying. What French is it? The Fifth Republic? What republic are they on now?
Yeah, and we're still paying them. Well, that's right. Then Haiti's still paying them again. This debt. What debt? How's it? Yeah.
Come on, let's. You're all skirting around the issue that we don't need another FEMA boondoggle. The same way we're already paying enough to Florida for hurricane repair work. Do we really need to own
Yeah,
Haiti
true,
and the
true, true.
Dominican Republic and and even the albatross around our neck with Puerto Rico is the ongoing FEMA money?
Well, even the albatross around our neck with your
I'm
hometown,
saying
Chris. I mean, what are
yes.
they doing there?
Yeah. Oh, it's I I there
Again,
are buildings starting to finally be rebuilt,
Are they? Okay.
after it's now a year plus, and but it's like a drip, drip, drip. You know, 10,000 structures got wiped out, and I think there's maybe a couple hundred people actually have permits
Wow.
to begin rebuilding. But, there's not enough people here to actually do that rebuilding,
Right.
you know.
Right.
So it's going to be, I mean, if you even look at recovery efforts in New Orleans, 20, 25 years later,
Yeah.
they're still rebuilding. Or the fires in Paradise, California were a lot more remote.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of the several thousand buildings, it was like 2 or 3 thousand that got burned down in that town.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe hundreds have been rebuilt 5, 6 years on,
Right.
but they're also far remote versus like the fires in Altadena and the Pacific Palisades are in huge, like massive population dense areas.
Mm-hmm.
So you would think it would be a faster process, and it's not.
Yeah.
It's not at all.
Yeah. We're just not that good at infrastructure in this century.
But I did have it was less than a week in. I sat down and went to see FEMA the first day they were on the boots on the ground, and I happened to be chatting with one of the senior FEMA directors, did my intake by pure happenstance, and I asked him, I was like, what is this? Are you guys going to be here for like a year or 2 years? And he's like, we're a week into this, and I can already tell you this is a 5-year boots on the ground FEMA operation.
Wow.
In this area. Like he's like, this is not a 6 months and we're done business. We're in it for at least 5, 6 years. So that totally shocked me.
Yeah.
Um,
yeah. Wow.
And the fact that he knew that like literally within the first week of the most devastating urban fire in American history.
Well, it sounds like he was the right guy to have his boots on the ground. So for next week, we're reading to the end of the section to about page 212. Yeah.
Okay.
And hopefully it will be a less intense news week than this last one was.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
We've been saying that for 5 books
every
now,
week.
I know. Yeah, I just wrote down OBC 33 on my card. I was like, holy crap, that's 33. We've been doing this for a while.
And some of these we've done
multiple
two
books,
at
yeah.
a time.
Right. We've got a couple of those. Yeah. Probably well over close to 40 books now. So we're doing all right.
And even with that, there's a couple I want to go back and revisit still.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Well, have a good week. Thanks very much.
Thanks. You too.